Welcome to my 1000 subscriber special. And I know I'm a little bit late, because at the time I'm recording this, we are already close to 2000 subscribers. And I guess that shows what immense support you have been giving me the last couple of weeks, which have just been crazy. So thank you so much and keep it up. And when we hit the 1000 subscribers, which was about a week ago, I asked you to send me all your questions that you have about me and my artwork. And you certainly delivered with many very good ones. So, let's just start with the first one, which is also the easiest of all of them. And that is, how long have you been 3D modeling? And that would be for about 4 years. I started in March 2020 to learn the basics of Blender, watch tutorial videos, work alongside, getting all the foundations in. And in April of the same year I started on my first own project without guidance. And this narrow gauge passenger wagon was my first project. And it felt like the greatest thing I had created in my entire life so far. Even though pretty quickly that passenger wagon turned into this one. And then I started creating wagons based on actual prototypes, like these goods wagons, and even tried my first locomotives. Even though this one's not really based on a real prototype and more on a certain G-scale model you might be familiar with. And that also leads us to the second question. What led you to 3D modeling? I could dedicate a whole video to this question, even though I'm not really sure I want to, but I certainly could. And the main reason is that I'm not really content with the models available on the market these days. And there are two main issues I have. And one of them is that with the detailed craze we have seen in the last 20 years, where the manufacturers are racing to have the most intricate, the most detailed model, that a lot of other aspects have been lacking quite a bit. You cannot take something out of the real world, shrink it down and place it back in. It would look distorted. Not even to mention the physics, which don't scale down. But also the human perception doesn't scale. So you have to adjust things, you have to simplify things. You have to overemphasize on important details and leave out the unimportant ones. And every major manufacturer knows that. But still it gets more and more kind of forgotten. And without diving too deep into art theory, I just give you a simple example of what I mean. If you have a model of a steam locomotive, and real steam locomotives are quite rugged, heavy pieces of engineering. But if the model of such a piece of engineering looks fragile, I'm not talking about being fragile, I'm talking about looking fragile, then something went wrong. And alongside with it is also the lack of posability, especially with goods wagons, for example. With collector's models you usually don't have them, even in large scales, where openable doors wouldn't be an issue at all, and therefore make it impossible to create loading scenes, for example. And as such, in a way steal the character of a certain wagon, because you could phrase it that way. I don't actually want to create models of real life locomotives and wagons. What I do want is to create small versions of them. So of course a covered wagon has to have openable doors, otherwise you couldn't put stuff in it. And a wheel tipper needs to be tippable, because otherwise it just doesn't make sense. And that also helps to make the models more believable. And really the trick here is that I'm not trying to produce models that are photorealistic, but rather those who feel immersive. Especially if eventually I do 3D print them, you can take them in your hand and you feel like you have a proper locomotive in your head, a proper wagon. A proper thing and not just a fake image of the real thing, if you know what I mean. And another issue is that as someone who has a broad interest into railways or transportation in general, we will come back later to that. When you want to collect models from Great Britain, from continental Europe, Northern America, you stumble upon the issues that all these models are made from different manufacturers with all their different handwritings. And in my opinion, if you have them all next to each other, they just look really out of place. They don't go well together, not even to mention the scale issue with British models. So for a long time it was dawning to me, if I want to have, in quotation mark, everything in the same scale and the same handwriting, I just had to do it myself. And eventually a good friend of mine who works professionally with 3D modeling introduced me to Blender, and he got me hooked. So I downloaded the software, opened it, miserably failed. If you work with Blender yourself, you know what I mean. So I watched tutorials, learned it, and you know, the rest is history. But as we already have talked about collecting models, I think the next question is quite fitting. Do you have a model railway layout in real life? If so, what scale? And no, I don't actually have a layout, but rather just a loose collection of model trains. The majority of them is in HO scale, once again because you have the broadest availability of stuff there. And that leads us to the next question, a very good one. How do you choose which prototype to recreate in 3D? And there are of course two sides. One of course is always personal interest. However, I try, especially in the recent 2 years, to more and more put the personal interest to the side and rather go by what makes sense. And there are certain aspects I'm looking out for in choosing what prototype to do next. One is of course, how iconic is a locomotive? How well known or liked is it by enthusiasts these days? Another aspect is how important is it actually in railway history? Did the locomotive achieve big numbers, or is it just from a technological aspect a really important piece of engineering? And a third and very important aspect is, does that locomotive class or wagon or truck or whatever it is fill a niche in my catalog, in my range of models that hasn't been filled yet? You know, you have a goods locomotive, you have a passenger locomotive, you have a shunter, you have an express locomotive. Because I don't just want individual locomotives that don't fit together. I want to have a complete range. Things that make sense together. But that leads us to the next assortment of questions. And those who ask, what is your favorite something? And I find it kinda difficult to pick favorites, especially as I think the beauty of transportation, especially railways, is its diversity. On the one side, the diversity of different systems. You know, compare the British railways with the North Americans. These are just so completely different, and that makes both so charming in their own ways. But also within one system. You have the big iconic express locomotives, you have the small branch line locomotives and the shunters. Still, I have to face these questions. And the first one especially I quite like, because it's very specific, making it easier, not easy, but easier to answer. And that question is, what is your favorite German locomotive you haven't modeled yet? And that would be the Bavarian S36. Especially those ordered by the Deutsche Reichsbahn with the angled cap sides as well as the smoke deflectors. Because in some way these locomotives stand between the elegant state railway designs, you know, with their long thin boiler, as well as the bulky standard designs, where you have the angled cap sides from and the smoke deflector squaring off the fronts. So you have machines that are both very elegant but also quite rugged, and I just love that combination. Okay, on to the next question. What is your favorite railway company and what is your favorite locomotive of them? I think for this question I now stick with the German theme. It just makes the most sense as that is what I have been dealing with the past 4 years, and you know, generally speaking, I don't think it makes a lot of sense trying to compare a Class 44 with a 9F and that again with a Challenger. But when it comes to German railway companies, I definitely have to pick the Prussian State Railways as my favorite. And the reason is simple. Because of its long time of existence and also its massive size it eventually reached. There's just such a huge variety of stuff. Everything from tiny old-timer steam locomotives to somewhat modernish electric locomotives, early multiple units, the first iteration of the S-Bahn. You have all of that. And my favorite Prussian locomotive would be the very elegant tank locomotive T18. And then we come to the ultimate question, what is your favorite locomotive? Once again, I answer it in the context of German railways, and there it is definitely the Class 24, the so-called Steppenpferd, the prairie horse. What makes the 24 so special is that, in a way, it's a proper passenger locomotive with tender, 3 large-ish driven axles, even smoke deflectors, a running board leading all the way around the boiler. You know, it has everything. But it's still so small. Compared to a Class 01, it is tiny. And in a quite different direction leads the next question. And that is, how do you see the rail industry evolve in Europe? I mean, that's one you could make a whole video series on its own, of course. But To make it short, we all know that the rail industry isn't in the best spot. A lot of it is caused by bad political decisions, even though we cannot just blame the politics for it, as they only mirror the public opinion, which is in generally very pro-road traffic and pro-private transport. However, with many issues that I think became really obvious the last years. One of them is climate change. Another one is the continuous truck driver shortages we've seen in different places. They kind of make the general public aware that we need the railways more than we think we do. And in that context, there also have been political decisions that go in the right direction in the past years. And especially if we talk about things like the automatic couplings, which maybe this time finally will actually be introduced in Europe, in a way a century late. And in fact, already in the 1920s, the Deutsche Reichsbahn tested automatic couplings. And in the 1960s, it was planned to introduce them Europe-wide, but as we all know, that didn't come to anything. So that these things might now finally happen, that is something that's, I think, very good and which makes me mildly positive about the future of the rail industry. You know, mildly positive. Now we get to the topic where I received the most questions, even though most of them are duplicates, but it's apparently a topic you're quite interested in, and that is my modeling process. So the first question is, what references and sources do I use and where do I get them? And I use all kind of different sources. Usually I start with the internet, because there are some very good websites made by enthusiasts, and you find more good photographs than you would think, and you can even find some drawings. But at the very least, you will find what books have been published on a certain topic. And that is the next and very important step, to acquire those books, because the information you will find on the internet is always quite sparse and often not really reliable. And these books also include more drawings, printed in a good resolution, and especially photographs, all of the photographs. When we talk about state railway designs, it is very difficult to find early photographs in the internet. Generally, of course, there aren't many early photographs of them, and most of them only ever make their way into printed publications. And that also goes for many images from factory archive, who might show a locomotive in its construction phase, which gives you angles and views you usually don't get. Of course, with the printed literature, there's always the issue that most of the books are out of print, and you have to hunt them down, and you usually have to be quite patient to get them at a reasonable price. And last but certainly not least, and maybe the most important source, are of course the real locomotives. So whenever I have the chance to visit a preserved example, I try to do it, take as many photographs as possible from all of the odd angles you wouldn't see anywhere else, because, you know, why would the usual trained enthusiast make a picture from underneath the frame? That's something you only really want and need if you're creating models, but then you desperately need those angles. But that also brings me to the next question. How does your modeling process look like from research to designing? Really, the first step to creating a model is research. That is finding good images, finding good drawings, learning about all the details and especially the detail variations that happen over time. And at that stage, it's also a good idea to already think about what variants, what liveries do you want to recreate. When we talk about locomotives like the Prussian P8, for example, there are just so many modifications that occurred over time, so many liveries. It's just impossible to recreate them all, so I have to pick and choose. And once that research state is concluded, of course in the process you will always have to come back to it, because there's always some details you've missed. That's just normal. Then what I do is really think about how will that model go together. What are individual parts? What is molded onto a bigger part? How does the overall construction work? What are features and functions that model is supposed to have? You know, will the doors be openable or not? I have to think about those things. Because if you take that time before you even open Blender and think carefully about the construction, you will have a much easier time creating the actual model than if you go in there blindly. And once I have collected all my thoughts and I know what I'm doing, then I can open Blender, set up a new file, import the drawings, They help me a lot, even though you shouldn't overestimate the value of drawings. Not only can they be incorrect, especially if you have overview drawings and they are full of errors, you still have to keep in mind that you are creating a model. You're not manufacturing a real locomotive. You have to work in a different size, with different materials, with different manufacturing techniques. So, more important than drawings are always photographs, because they tell you how the thing really looked like. They give you an impression of the appearance, of the spirit that you want to capture. So, while the drawing is great to get down the first shape, you then always have to amend according to photographs, and often you will also then see where the drawings are incorrect. And that involves, of course, a lot of trial and error, especially with small details like headlamps especially, which you have to slightly overscale so that they appear correct. Of course, also not too much, so that's quite a thin line to go there. And that's also where most of the hours go into, those small details. Which brings me to the next question. How long does it take to make one model? I get asked that question a lot. Not only here on YouTube, also by my friends, and I never have a good answer. One of the reasons is that I'm just not good at time tracking for an individual project, as I usually work on multiple projects at the same time, and also because every locomotive, if we stick with locomotives, is very different. But just to give you a rough number, a very rough number, I would say around 40 hours for a mid-sized locomotive. So I'm talking maybe about an E10, which as a modern locomotive is rather simple in terms of details, but has a very complex body shape. And you might say the E10, I'm not talking about the streamlined ones, but the regular ones. It looks like a brick, it can't be that difficult. But these rounded edges on both cap ends, they are just so difficult to get right. Or, also taking around 40 hours, a mid-sized steam locomotive which doesn't have those complex shapes, but a lot of small pipework and rivets and all kind of small details that really take a lot of time. Because getting the first draft of a locomotive done is actually rather quick. It's only a couple of hours and you already see what I'm going for, but really those details, they take up the most time. And when I say 40 hours, then I mean really a model that I can show off in a video, that I can use for rendering, but not one that is print ready. That would probably take another 40 hours, even though you would barely see any difference. However, I often can reuse parts. Especially with standardized locomotives, I don't have to start over from scratch, as I can borrow parts from other locomotives. Sometimes I don't have to alter these parts at all. In other cases, these parts are a good starting point, I just have to modify them. But another thing to keep in mind, even if I say 40 hours for a locomotive, I don't create a locomotive in 1 week. In 1 work week that would be. Because obviously, on one side I also do videos, and then I also have real life obligations, so I just don't have 40 hours to work in Blender a week. And even if I had, I wouldn't advise working 40 hours straight on the same project, because that's the easiest way to lose your sanity. In general, I work on multiple at the same time, so I can just switch to a different project if I need to, and therefore getting one model from the start to the finish line is a lengthy process, but it also gives the opportunity to step back every once in a while and see if you're actually going the right direction. And really, the longer you work on a locomotive, the better of a feeling you get for it. Yeah, I hope that gave you a little bit of an insight of my work process. And now let's take a look at the future of SteelBridge models. And one question I receive quite a lot is, have you considered uploading your models into any train-related video games? Unfortunately, however, that's something that probably won't happen. To make my models really work in video games, they would require a lot of optimization, which my models usually don't receive, as with the intention for 3D printing, that is just extra work that's not really necessary and I could just use on creating another model. And of course, with a video game, your possibilities are different. While with 3D printing I have to stick to certain wall thicknesses. You don't have these constraints and would therefore expect thinner side walls. So to really make my models into good content for video games, they would require a lot of reworking I just don't have the time to put into them. And another frequently asked question is if it is possible or will be possible in the future to purchase models from me. And I have to split that question into two parts, the first one being digital models, and that is something I do not plan. But if we're talking about purchasing physical models, that is something I'm considering. However, as I don't even have printed the models for myself, I can't make any promises just right now. I'll have to see how it works out, how long it takes to print and assemble an individual model, and how expensive that would make them, if I think there's enough demand at that given price point. But that is certainly something I'm considering, but it will take some time until we get there. And now we come to the future of my models themselves. And one very good question is, do you plan to add interiors to your models? And yes, that's something I definitely plan to do. In fact, you will already see some interiors in my next video about the first of the wagons of the 1962 Rheingold, and I also plan to do interiors for my locomotives. So far they only have just some basic shapes, so it's not completely empty, but I do plan to detail it out more. However, the interiors will always remain kinda simple, so they don't detract from the outside, the actual focus point of my models. But still, a simplified but still proper interior is necessary, and once I have done it for a locomotive, I will also show it off in my videos. And then I also got asked, do you plan on covering railways from other places? In particular, I was asked about the United States or United Kingdom, and the answer to that is definitely yes. I always wanted to do that. In fact, I already have created some models of British and North American prototypes, mostly narrow gauge, but also some standard gauge, and I plan to do more. However, as I'm always thinking about having a complete catalog, a complete collection of stuff, I don't just wanna drop a British locomotive here and a North American there without having other stuff to go with it. So at the moment I'm refraining a little bit from going abroad until I'm happy with my German collection, and then I can start thinking about other countries, or other countries in general. And in particular, I was also asked about East German locomotives or multiple units, and also here my answer is definitely yes. I do plan on doing East German stuff. However, once again, I don't just want to do a random East German locomotive, but rather try to tie it in with what I already have. And also with multiple units in general, I don't have done anything so far, but I will do them, of course. The issue with multiple units is that they require a lot of work, as you have to do a whole train at once, and they don't give you a lot of flexibility. That's probably why I have stayed away so far from them, but that will definitely change in the future. And the final question I wanna really like is, would you consider talking about South African engines manufactured in German works? And I mean, generally, that's a very fascinating field. Of course, Germany exported a lot of locomotives, and these often were designs that were very different from locomotives used in Germany, both standard as well as narrow gauge. So I would love to do something in that regard. I also have some drawings in my collection, so ideal start off point. But once again, either I create a whole collection of South African models, or I tie it in with my German models somehow. I can't promise anything at that point, but I'm certainly looking into it, and I mean that's a general issue. In fact, I have plans for the next 5 years of models to do. But what actually will get done and what will not be finished in time, or what other projects may come in between, it's just impossible to foresee. And that is why you should take everything I said with a grain of salt, but either way, there are many exciting projects coming, and with that I thank you all so much for your interest into my work and for your incredible support, and take care, and see you again in the next video here at Steel Bridge Models.